kind of walk through several different aspects of building a disability inclusive workforce and workplace. So my background is 25 years human resources, and having been on the employer side most of that time. I also had a stint as executive director for the National Organization on Disability out of New York. But what I want to talk about today is really kind of that overall overarching perspective of what does disability in the workplace look like? How do I even get started? It can be a daunting idea. And hopefully today we're going to be able to give you a little bit more information about how to do that, and even give you some real tangible things to be able to do after this call and after this webinar to be able to go and make an impact or start making an impact in your own organization to further the disability population within your workplace, or start preparing for that. One of the big questions that people have is, what is a disability? And this here, I wanted to show you just kind of how disabilities break down in terms of, hearing and mobilities, cognitive, developmental, psychiatric, and vision. Interesting part, 1 out of every 4 individuals right now has some form of disability. There's been discussion within the disability space that might actually start dropping even further to 1 out of 3 in the next few years, because of the we have the impact of COVID-19 and what do those long-termers, how is that going to impact? And so those numbers are going to fluctuate. Unfortunately, it's not going to go. It's just going to keep going down. 71% of people with disabilities have an invisible disability, which is one of that huge population that people are like, well, you don't look disabled, right? I mean, it seems like it's a litmus test that people have if you to justify your disability. I have a disability. I have, 2 stents in my heart from 2 years ago. And so I did not, didn't plan on it. It wasn't something I was going to have happen, plan on doing, but 2 heart attacks, that was enough. And so the interesting part is, especially that last part, is 83% of individuals with disabilities acquire their disability later in life. That means only 17% are born with their disability. So basically, if we live long enough, you will most likely have some sort of disabling condition within your lifetime. As an employer, that means our employees will most likely have some sort of disabling condition during their time of employment with us. And one thing that we have to look at is, when we talk about disability employment, we're talking about the entire life cycle of the employee's lifetime at your job, whether it starts from recruiting individuals specifically with disabilities, or understanding that your team, somebody on your team will acquire a disability later. How are you retaining them? So are you really closing the back door? Or are they going to have to go someplace else to look for another job that might be more accommodating for them? The disability inclusion journey really is more of a journey. The destination, certainly we have on here, the green competitive sign, but, any organization who's been doing inclusion, especially in the disability space, it's a journey. The destination is always going to be out there for you to continue to shoot for, even if you think you have a really good disability program. So the quick down and dirty is, a lot of companies, disability inclusion is not even on their radar. It's nothing they're talking about. It's not a matter of topic of discussion within the organization. They believe that they may or may not have anybody who has a disability, or, hey, talking about disabilities is taboo within our organization. So it's if not being on the radar at all. Then you get to the compliance part, and compliance is an area where a lot of companies that have to hire, perhaps they're federal contractors and they're tracking metrics. This is where a lot of companies just get stuck. This is their, it's good enough, which talking to people who, I have to hit a certain level or a certain number, or look to be, we're doing the right thing, but it's just only compliance driven. It's not based upon business needs, not based upon business necessity, other than let's go after our contracts. The next stage is competence, where the organization starts to talk about disabilities. Maybe you're starting to have policies and practices that might come into play. Maybe it's, maybe it's being talked about in other areas. Perhaps you might even have a uh, business resource group or employee resource group that's centered around individuals with disabilities or families with individuals with disabilities. So that's the competence. The capability is like, hey, you know what, let's start having some trainings and making sure that, October, National Disability Employment Awareness Month, we celebrate that. Or maybe we have people who, we're talking about accommodations. We have an interactive process that we go through. We have an accommodations process that's not just stuck in a 3-ring binder on a shelf in HR, but everybody knows about it. That's the developing the capabilities. Then you finally, eventually, it's the competitive, right, where you understand that diversity within your workforce makes you a stronger organization, but people with disabilities in particular have a major impact. And now you're leveraging the fact that your diverse workforce is making you competitive in the market, making you competitive within your competition, and that you're able to be in a situation where it's like, this is good for our business, versus, well, we're doing it because we have to, or, we're just kind of figuring our way through it. It's like, it's a competitive advantage. 95% of the US population states that they would give their dollars and resources to organizations they view as disability friendly. That in itself is an interesting way to talk to somebody in the C-suite. It can be financially beneficial for you to be in the disability space. I just want to, as we're going through this, I just want to take, 5 seconds real quick and just sit there and say, where do you think that you're at on this road and this journey? And then certainly the other question is where do you want to be? And what I'm hoping to do today is, in the conversation, is to be able to give you a little bit to help you move maybe to the next milestone on this road, or at least make you get off that it's not on our radar. Now let's start having some conversations within the organization. All right. So one of the things I want to do is be able to sit and talk to you, unpack what disability inclusion in the workplace can look like. But what we're going to do is kind of take it piece by piece, so that you can look at the different aspects that you can have, or maybe it's one thing that we start working on, and not try and drink the entire ocean all in one gulp, because it can be daunting at times. The first place I want to start is with leadership. Leadership and being inclusive business culture. Certainly, it's an enterprise-wide commitment to disability, diversity, and inclusion. Nothing happens, and we all are aware as we're in our businesses, if the top doesn't get it, then it's not probably going to go anywhere, and you're always trying to push the proverbial, boulder uphill, and it gets harder and harder when, especially if you're the only person pushing. So certainly getting top level leadership engaged. Managers, supervisors, and other key personnel have to understand their role in facilitating inclusive culture, and the commitments and the goals are communicated to all employees. And that's one aspect, and being able to have leadership be help drive it. Even if you have somebody who's an executive sponsor, who has the ear of the top, that might be able to help move some of the initiatives along, get through some of the sticky points. But that does help. But on the other hand, it also helps that if you have managers and supervisors, now I'm not the only one pushing this boulder. We're all in it together, and that is, having leadership involved is a big deal. There are some organizations out there, where leadership is bold about the disability space. Julie Sweet, from Accenture, in the top left, um, is, straight out there saying, here's what we need to do within our organization. Jenny Leigh Fleury, who, if you have not had the opportunity to talk or hear her present, she's fantastic. But just talking about what the impact it's had at Microsoft. Now, I do know Accenture, Microsoft, and that sort of stuff are large organizations, but I want to turn you to the next screenshot there of the Valuable 500. if you get an opportunity, go out and look at the Valuable 500. This is a group of organizations on a worldwide movement who have committed themselves to increasing disability awareness and their disability initiatives within their organizations. And I think there are over 375 CEOs have signed on for that worldwide. And I'm happy to say that you can see on there, Ally Global Services is one of them, which is, my organization. But I do want to, take a look at that, and don't, if you are a mid-sized or small-sized business, I would say you have the ability to actually make a bigger impact within your organization than these large companies do, because of the fact that you can cut through red tape much quicker, and be able to uh, initiate things on a much broader scale. So one of the things that, when you're talking about it is, develop and communicate policy statements and other examples, demonstrating commitment to disability, diversity, and inclusion, establish a cross-functional team. This is where you start getting, it's not an HR thing. It's not an outreach issue. It's, let's talk about our execs, our managers, get your sales teams involved, get your operations people involved. You'll find that disability is no longer a taboo conversation. We're no longer sending people to go live in communes around the country. Disability is real. Disability is hitting every family member knows somebody, or at least a friend who has some sort of disability. So being able to have that conversation and get people on board within your organization across functions helps really get disability inclusion embedded. But then also having some sort of written component of diversity within the performance of key positions. Let's talk about diversity. What are our diversity numbers? And maybe it's your executive team who have a metric that they're measured year over year with regards to diversity and inclusion and disability inclusion. I've seen more and more companies saying hiring managers and HR and recruiters have to have more of a metric now of people who've self-disclosed, of individuals who have disabilities, and they're measured on that as part of their performance management. But then then also there's the foundations, the policies and procedures, which we just quickly touched about, training and resources, and being able to increase understanding and awareness, position-specific training and tools. Your trainers should not only be trained on how to train in a process or procedure or how to make a widget. It's understanding, okay, let's even start with what are the adult learning styles. And from there, how do I know that I may be getting through to somebody that they understand what I'm saying? Because I ask questions, I ask probing questions versus making an assumption that I said it, they got it. I think it's very interesting to say that I'm going to take a quick pause. And when I'm talking about that is if you have an opportunity, grab a piece of paper with you and grab a pen. If you're making notes, hopefully you're taking lots of notes right now. But I just want you to draw a star on a piece of paper. And if we had all of our cameras on and that sort of stuff, so just draw a star for me. I'm going to go out on a limb and say most of you probably drew some sort of 5-pointed star or 6-pointed star or what have you, something that looks astrologically representative, right? Something. But I would say the interesting part about it is that when I asked that same question with individuals who were in the audience who had autism, one of them actually drew Lady Gaga. You're like, well, you're supposed to draw a star. Well, that's because we all heard the exact same thing. How it was processed was different, right? And so Lady Gaga is a star. So as we're training, how do I know that I'm actually getting through to people? Well, I have to check for understanding. And so being able to have that conversation with people, whether, and autism isn't, there's not something that you necessarily notice or see or what have you, but you never know who you're talking to. And so having practices that are allowing people to set them up for greater success, and your trainers to be more successful is just one of those small things that you can do. And identify and address issues that may be creating barriers with recruitment, hiring, and retention. So I don't know, a lot of us have to now are going about applicant tracking systems and being able to do electronic applications and things within our organizations, just because from a pure tracking standpoint. Another quick takeaway: go to your applicant tracking system, and on there should be some button, some link or something for somebody to click on, or a phone number for them if they have trouble filling out the application. Click on it, call the number, see what happens. Do not be surprised if you do not hear back from somebody, or you go to a voicemail and then still don't hear back from somebody. That is a simple way for us to sit there and say, look, I have an applicant tracking system, that's great, but if I cannot fill it out, I cannot apply for your organization. What we've done several times, and we had an organization work with just this last year, went through and called the number that was on there. It went to a dead voicemail. A voicemail, somebody was pleasant and recording, but we never heard back. We even tracked it for 9 weeks and nobody ever called us back. So, another key takeaway that you can take, just go and try that and see if if your applicant tracking system is actually a barrier to employment itself. So what does this look like in practice? Non-discriminatory and disability inclusive language is in policies, manuals, and other written materials. I will say that if you have an EEO statement or equal opportunity employer statement, read it, because oftentimes disability is not included in that, and disability is obviously a diversity segment. Provide general disability awareness training to all employees. It, there's one thing about, okay, my managers are trained, my executives are trained, but training the people who are actually going to sit and work next to that individual, you'll be surprised how much fear is revealed and put to ease, because, okay, well, we're going to hire people with disabilities, that's great, but what does that mean for me? What if I say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, what have you? And I know Wanda and Cedar provide that type of training, so maybe that's the next step for you, is to reach out to them and say, hey, can we do some general disability awareness training, and just start a conversation. Existing HR policies and practices, job descriptions, maybe creating barriers. I will say that if, I don't know how many people here are HR, but if you're in HR, certainly look at legacy policies that have been there. Really take a look at, what's the accommodation policy? And as I mentioned earlier, is it just in a 3-ring binder on a shelf, or do people know how to actually request an accommodation? And that's from the time they start their application to the time that they leave the organization. How do they engage the accommodation process? And so what are those barriers? Legacy job descriptions, oh my gosh, I mean, some of them were written, I get it, back in the day when accountants had to move, bankers boxes full of stuff. And so I'm an accountant, and, I have to still be able to live 50 to 75 pounds. Really? It's all electronic. So go back and review your job descriptions just to see if they're accommodating, or if there's something there that may, in a way, need to be scrubbed or reevaluated in the jobs. So pipelines, where do I find talent? How do I do this? You have to be intentional. This is not something that just happens. You need to have partnerships and being able to start talking about your organization. But the biggest part about it is that you have to have your house in order first. Those policies, those practices, those procedures, that training, and that sort of stuff. Make sure that you're ready. The worst thing that can happen is for somebody to be able to say, okay, we're ready to go. Let's go hire people with disabilities. That's great. But then all of a sudden we hire the first person and we have no idea what to do. Our hiring managers don't understand how to have performance management conversations. Or, hey, we're going to go hire somebody because it's going to make us feel really good and really help them out. If you hire for charity, I can promise you it will be a disaster down the road, because of the fact that too many people think that I'm going to do good by hiring somebody with a disability and just going to make myself feel better. What do you do when you're paying somebody else the same wages, but you're taking an individual with disability and saying, okay, 50% productivity is fine, but somebody else is having to hit 100 internally? That's going to cause conflict. Your hiring managers are going to feel handcuffed because of the fact that they're not going to be able to have conversations about productivity. It's like, okay, so you're the token individual who's come in as with a disability. Don't do that. It's same job, same pay, with the same expectations, and that is the only way this is successful. And you know what, if they get to the point to where it's like this job isn't working out for them, that's okay. Give them back, give them the opportunity to go find something that actually works for them. So by doing, by hiring for charity, you're not doing anybody a service at all right? Internships are a fantastic way to get your toe in the water, and start there. The other part about it is internships can oftentimes lead to full-time jobs. So it's like, okay, let's start with low risk. Let's do an internship for a summer or a month or a week or whatever, and give somebody an opportunity to see your company. But it also gives your company an opportunity to kind of see if this actually is something they're going to work with. um, Brand your initiatives. Once you put a name to it, it's no longer, well, let's just the disability hiring thing that we're doing. Oftentimes it's like, oh, that's an HR thing. It'll, like any other HR things, they'll eventually go away, right? Brand it, put your logo on it and put a stamp on it and say, this is what we're planning on. This is what we're going to do. Um, and then use your employees as ambassadors. Everybody knows somebody out there who has a disability. And the amazing thing is, once employees start seeing that the organization is really disability friendly, they know people who they are wanting to refer to the organization at that point. So internal referrals from employees can be a great way to jumpstart your program. When I talk about branding, AMC Focus, which is one that I have the fantastic pleasure of help create when I was director of recruitment for AMC, was, focus stands for furthering opportunities, cultivating untapped strengths. And that's where we came up with the name. But it's got AMC, it's part of our culture, it's woven in. I mean, actually there's different logos that we have. We had the circle with AMC, and it's more of an aperture for a movie lens or movie projector. So it was branded, it's within who we were. Walgreens with their Ready program with retail employees with disabilities initiative, helping employees come in, and maybe they are future employees, or at least they're getting job skills that Walgreens allows people to go into their stores and work. So be intentional about it. Don't try and dip a toe, because you know what happens? Dipping a toe never works. It's like, let's commit, let's start doing this. Putting a toe in, it's really easy to pull it out, right? So make sure that you are committed to it. So then we talk about, outreach and recruitment. The disability population in the organizations you're going to talk to, you're going to have to go basically sell yourself to them, because there is some, and for good reason, skepticism on whether businesses are truly disability friendly or not. The interesting part is that ADA came out, almost 30 years ago, and ironically and unfortunately, we haven't moved the needle a whole lot. So irrespective of your political views, Congress wasn't necessarily sitting around trying to figure out how we're going to make some laws about disability employment and discrimination. There was a real thing, and it still is a real thing, that where we were taking advantage of people with disabilities. We're paying them sub minimum wage all the time. They were not getting the same rights as other employees. And so ADA was birthed. And unfortunately, like I said earlier, we haven't moved a whole lot. Um, that's part of the concern with ADA, is like, okay, it's there, but what are we doing? And it really boils down to, what are you doing at your company to help ADA proceed? Make sure you have formal plans and strategies for recruitment. And again, like I said, you're gonna have to sell yourself to the organizations or your outreach groups to make sure that you're not taking advantage of their population. On the flip side, if you do it right, that organization and that population will actually become your biggest advocates, and you can actually, in a way, start recruiting people um, they'll just start showing up. They'll be in employee referrals. I was working with an organization outside in small town in Tennessee, and very small town, but where it was sat on the major highways, Volkswagen was there, Amazon was there, Kroger Foods was there. So large populations and large businesses, they're pulling from all over the place. So that, and Kroger Foods was there, and they had 1,000-person facility. They hired an individual who was hearing impaired, and did it well, and it was a great relationship. Suddenly they found themselves within about 4 months having a dozen people who were hearing impaired working there, because they kept referring their friends and such, and so it becomes a self referral program. So anyway, doing things right will make a big difference in your recruitment and outreach. Hiring and retaining, obviously there's career sites and things that are out there, that we have. Starbucks certainly is doing a lot recently. They even have a store in Seattle now has, instead of saying Starbucks, it's all finger spelled for their signage. um, Ernst and Young, Microsoft. The big thing here is making sure that your career sites and materials, job announcements, they reflect disability inclusion. Now, you'll see people in wheelchairs, you'll see people signing and that sort of stuff. Obviously, we talked earlier that most individuals with disabilities have invisible disabilities, but in terms of your recruiting efforts and that sort of stuff, make sure that you are finding real people who you've employed, to be able to start attracting other individuals with disabilities. Um, I would also say the fact that being able to make sure that all job candidates have an opportunity to request an accommodation, uh, that your new hire orientation has ADA, um, you know, as only a foundation, but not really what your disability inclusion process is. If it's boiled, again, if it's baked and boiled in compliance, that's all you're ever going to get. So increase the ceiling. ADA should be the floor of your organization's disability initiative, and not the ceiling. And then HR managers have job specific disability training. For instance, interviews. All right, many of us are probably working with behavior based interviews. It's great, it's a tool, helps us. The idea is helps us, allows us predict future behavior by going back and looking at past behaviors. Fantastic. Well, when we were at AMC, we had a question on there. It's like, if you find $20 on the floor, what would you do? It's a pretty cut dry question, right? We asked that to 10 candidates who had cognitive challenges, and 9 out of 10 of them actually said they put it in their pocket. Probably the most honest answer out there, but certainly not one that's going to get a job. And so we had to kind of deconstruct that question to sit there and say, well, yeah, you would, but what are we really asking? What we're really asking was, if you were trained to take valuables, money, and that sort of stuff that you might find on the floor in an auditorium or in the hallway, to customer service or to a supervisor, are you able to do that? Would you be willing to do that? And the ironic thing was, they all said yes. I was like, that's exactly what we're asking for. We're not asking to them if they know how to play the game of behavior-based interviews, which is truly what it is. It's a game, but to be able to sit back and say, ask what you want, ask what you need to know in order for them to be screened properly. So anyway, that's just one of our ways of talking about job specific disability trainings. What do I do in the interview process? Productivity, and this just basically goes back to the same part of what are reasonable accommodations. They are defined as modifications to work or work environment that enables a qualified person with a disability to perform or to apply for or perform a job. They have to be able to at least do the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodation. And that is something that we really gloss over when we're talking about recruiting. Is like, can you do this with or without reasonable accommodation? We always say yes. Okay. Or we get the answer yes. Or If it's no, well, it's like I can't employ you. But if it's a yes, that's where we stop. Well, the yes should be more of an entrance into, if you need accommodations, what might that look like, versus, well, check the box, off they go to the job, and suddenly they can't perform it because we actually stopped asking the question, what do you need to do in order to make your job successful? So the accommodation is a philosophy, not necessarily a a one time, you get one opportunity to say yes or no and that's it. So we need to ask that and keep that in the back of our minds, because really accommodations, it's a scary word to a lot of organizations, because of the fact that it's like, oh, that's a legal thing. We have to get legal involved if we're talking accommodations. How about, instead of saying accommodations, we change that to job aid? And it's a job aid, right? I mean, anybody uses that. We all use job aids at any given time. So maybe that helps us to understand what we're doing and what we're not doing. Um, but have conversations. The interactive process that we talk about all the time in HR, it's like, I have to have a dialogue. We have to have a conversation. Now, if that person, if our employee does not want to engage in that dialogue, that's fine. But if they're not able to do their job, okay, well, that means there's performance management and possibility of termination. It happens. But not all accommodations, most accommodations cost nothing, right? And then over 50% costs less than $500. So this isn't like I have to go put a elevator in the middle of my distribution center for people to be able to get up to the second floor. No, I'm not asking that. Just how can people or modify their job, or where they have to go? So anyway, so that's part of it. And then the accommodations, certainly look at the possibility of taking the accommodations out of the manager's hands, so where they get the opportunity to say no without asking for somebody else to weigh in. Too many companies allow that for managers to say no, and then in a way it actually puts you at risk, because there has not been the interactive process. So um, then, we talk about, have the written policy. There are, make job candidates know how to apply for accommodations. And then we talked about the interactive process. So communication, obviously there's internal and external communication. Internal communications, from leadership certainly helps, as we talked earlier about pushing the initiative down through the organization. Um, but then, do you have disability related business resource groups or employee resource groups? Externally, make sure there's a public commitment to disability inclusion. It will attract talent and customers. And then, as we look here, as I mentioned earlier, there's the Starbucks where they fingerspell Starbucks. You can see with Clark's shoes that there is a very obvious individual with a uh, visual impairment who's using a cane. And then, obviously, then you have Nike, where they do a lot of sponsorships of Paralympics, and individuals with disabilities. So, um, you know, put yourself out there, but don't be fake. If all I'm doing is like, hey, I'm gonna go grab this just so I can go get good employees, and I'm gonna put a fake picture up there or what have you, please don't have one of your employees sit in a wheelchair that you've had laying around your office for a long time. That's the 1970s wheelchair, and it's, big, heavy metal thing. Quite frankly, that's like don't do that. I mean, it's better to not take that picture and try and stage something versus, finding an employee or even a candidate, or, somebody that, has a real disability. Um, but yeah, so just FYI about that. Um, be out there in the public, talk about disability, internally and externally. Leverage your BRG. So there's a difference, and some people may be going, what's a BRG, ERG? So BRG is a business resource group, and that is a group of individuals who are tasked with aiding the business because of their collective interests or commonalities. So BRG has a budget. It has real objectives that they have to perform, and you usually have an executive sponsor who's helping drive that organization, not necessarily leading it, but just being there to help get through some of the challenges. And ERG, I'd liken it more towards as a social interaction group, towards like I have a common interest, and so therefore we can hang out on a Thursday, for a happy hour or what have you. But we're not really impacting the business, other than it's a great group of people, and I get to know more about my fellow employees. BRG has a task; they have things that they have to work through, and I would say Facebook is one of the famous BRGs out there because of the fact that they have that group, that business resource group. They go into the test labs on every type of device that Facebook can be loaded on, and they try and break it. And like, how can you not access Facebook on flip phones, on iPads, on, you know, all these devices, from computers to even smartwatches now and that sort of stuff. So they go in and they try and figure out how they cannot access, or what functionality of Facebook they can access. And so that's part of their business resource group, is to go continue to make Facebook accessible. um, so that's an important part. Access, information technology and environment, certainly accessibility, being able to allow people to get to the jobs and job applications quickly, as we talked earlier about the applicant tracking systems. And then accessibility allows employees to fully participate in the workforce, maybe screen readers, maybe it's different types of software, what have you. Voice to text is really becoming more and more popular. Um, I do it. I have, my thumbs get tired sometimes when I'm texting my teenagers. So it is the voice to text, and that's an accommodation. I know some organizations who use Dragon, which is a software out there to help them even write. I mean, they just put on a headset like this and they talk, and it just, it helps them go through, the entire process of writing a paper, and they can do that. But then you also have, accessible information and communication technology, in environments like workspaces and meetings and that sort of stuff. I've worked with a large tech company, or a couple of tech companies, and you know they're great campuses, but oftentimes they have some of the most marvelous workspaces to where you can sit out in the common area and work if you want to be around people. On the other hand, you can lock yourself almost into a dark closet if you really need to focus, or that's where you're comfortable. That's another workspace. So the days of us kind of coming into our cubicles and sitting down and that's where we work, certainly look at your workspace and see if you're accommodating to that. The other thing I would mention is cubes are okay. They just have to be big enough to make sure that you can get somebody safely in and out with a wheelchair. Um, so obviously ADA accessibility standards are there. If you have an older building, some of those get grandfather claused in. There are organizations out there who will actually help you with your web design, and being able to help you. Hopefully I just got to notice my internet's unstable. Hopefully we can get through. Sorry, um, we're dealing with storms in the area. Our company has a process for employees to request accommodations, activities on and off site. The other thing I would mention is when you're having a company-wide meeting, and if you think that there may be people who have hearing impairment, schedule an interpreter to come in for the larger meetings. um, or make sure that when you're hosting those larger meetings, that they are accessible, that people who have mobility issues can get around and get through. I made the mistake one time, where we were going to host something on the first floor, and I had that all figured out. Well, then at the last minute we had to move to the fifth floor. Did not realize that some of the escalator, the only way to get up was escalators, except for a freight elevator way back in the back. And that was rather embarrassing because I'm leading a disability awareness program, and I just messed it up myself because I was like, okay, well, first floor, and then I didn't think about the escalators. Not a good idea for people with wheelchairs or walkers or whatever. So anyway, it was rather embarrassing having to walk people back to the freight elevator so they could get upstairs. But anyway, it happens. So let's continue to try and be mindful. And then we also have the fact that accountability and growth, best practices. The journey doesn't stop when you do one thing. It should be, what's my next thing I'm going to do? So we talked about training. we talked about just basic etiquette training. What do I do? What do I say? What don't I do? What happens if I say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing? But then also there's training for managers. How do I have, what is it like to manage somebody with a disability? How do I engage in conversations when it's, I have this thing called a job coach. What's that, and who are they? Is that free labor that I get with the hiring this person, or what? How does that work? And so, that job coach can be a nebulous thing. There's one of the things we put out was kind of a rules of engagement. It's like, what does a job coach need to do on your job? And I would be so, and I'll talk to Wanda and Cedar, but I have some handouts that I can send to you via email or whatever. But that rules of engagement for job coaches is probably one of the best tools that I've been able to use and created, which, because like, I don't, as an employer, I don't know what to do with the job coach. Here's how this works. Unfortunately, I had one employer the other day call me and say that they found the job coach stealing from the company, so they fired the employee. Wait a second, what? The job coach is an accommodation for the employee. Don't terminate the employee. I mean, it was just one of those things you had to walk them through. They're like, oh, well, yeah, okay. You know, a job coach is basically an accommodation. It's like if somebody was need a stool because they hurt their back playing, being weekend warrior softball player, would we give them a stool? Yeah, we give them a stool. But if one of those legs breaks and it's not necessarily accommodating them in the way they need to be, am I going to ask them to balance on two legs of a stool because they have a bad back? No. I get a new stool. Well, same thing with a job coach. Job coaches, can be replaced if they're not doing their job. And most providers who provide job coaches are in complete and full agreement with that. So anyway, just FYI, I can certainly make that available to you, the rules of engagement for job coaches as well. So always measure. What gets measured gets managed. And then if there's any way for you to designate somebody with skin in the game, an executive or whatever, to say disability inclusion is part of your job description, that's a great thing to help move the needle and get things going there. Then certainly, our talking about training is always an ongoing process. Position-specific disability-related training, and then establishing goals and objectives and benchmarks to measure your progress. So really, we talked about building an inclusive foundation, and I want to be mindful of time so people can ask questions if they have any. But it looks like it's a lot, but at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is enhancing your culture, right? So every aspect of this, and talking about hiring individuals with disabilities, retaining people with disabilities, having an inclusive culture, it is all about who we are, and being able to look at every aspect of this, right? So when we talk about laying the foundation, building pipelines, hire retention, ensure productivity, communication, access, and continuous improvement, all, with leadership leading the way, that's how we build workplace inclusivity. So one of the things I will talk about, and I'm going to send over to you here, Cedar and Wanda can push it out via email. You're going to get a self-assessment survey that's going to show you, and let me see if I can share you the screen. Apparently I don't have it up. There it is. So you'll actually receive this disability inclusion self-assessment, and what it is at the top, you're like, it's a 0, disagrees 1, someone disagrees 2, someone agrees 3, and 4 is totally agree, but allows you in each one of the components we talked about earlier to go and score yourself, and the top score is 12. This is something that you can go through with your team to help you understand, where are we, what are some of the gaps, and what's some low-hanging fruit that we might be able to go and start initiating. So some of you may take this on your own. I would then ask you to then sit down, have a conversation with it, with your team, to be able to uh, have those conversations with your team and see where you're at as an organization. The last thing I will share is, oh, hold on, go back to this. Hopefully I didn't click myself out. Huh, interesting. Um, Allied Inclusion Works is certainly available for you. I just want to make sure that this is actually sharing on the right screen. It's a problem having too many screens sometimes. But anyway, I would actually say the Inclusion Works is here. Certainly Wanda and Cedar have large number of connections and such, but being able to get a hold of us, if you have any questions, we're more than happy to help. And my name's up there. My email address is there. Rob Hoffman, who some of you may or may not know, is certainly a Wyoming native, has done a lot in the disability space, is our director for Inclusion Works. Unfortunately, he's not able to meet with us today, but anyway, so that's how you can get a hold of us. And I believe this is being recorded. So anyway. Uh, Oh, and somebody asked me earlier, I couldn't see all your stuff. Sorry, Cedar, about making my full screen. I guess probably got to peek behind the curtain, I guess, a little bit. But anyway, does anybody have any questions or anything that I can answer for you?
Yeah, and that's all good, Andy. We are recording this, and we will make sure to share your slideshow with everybody that attended today so they can have that. And thank you for sharing, the checklist. I think that's going to be really helpful for everyone here as they're trying to figure out the next steps.
Yes. As I mentioned earlier, I will also be sharing the rules of engagement for job coaches to help kind of demystify what a job coach is and what it is not. And also allows employers to understand they're an accommodation. I have control. I have expectations that job coach should be meeting. And so I will also provide that. I'll send over to you. I could not, for some reason, could not share that on my screen today, but I will get that. People have hard copy in their email.
Great. Thank you, Andy. And if anyone is here that is going to receive credits from SHRM for this, I'm going to include that in the chat here. And then in another email, I will include that number there too that you guys will need. Yeah, would love to know if anybody has questions for Andy about, what you're trying to do, questions on what he presented, any of that. Please feel free to type in the chat or even in the Q&A. And I guess, well, it feels like we have a very quiet bunch today, Andy, but I will say too, if anyone is interested, Cultivatability does offer disability awareness trainings. Our next one is coming up April 21st. We usually host those about every other month. And I will include our website here, but you can always go to cultivatability.org to find that out. And it's a great first step for a lot of people as well.
Peter, with that, just I have a question for you about that training. How long is it that you offer the sessions?
It's a 1-hour training. It's virtual, at least for now until we can meet in person. But it's kind of a good silver lining is that you can be anywhere and join us virtually. And we try to leave some room at the end for really interactive Q&A.
Do you do any diagnosis specific training? Say an organization wants to learn more about autism or what have you. Is that something that you offer?
Not
Or
currently. And I don't know, Wanda, do you guys offer any diagnosis specific trainings? It may be something we do in the future, but not currently.
No, we do not.
I'm not trying to plug me, but we do that. But on the other hand, it also not only diagnosis specific, but it's also, managers and understanding some of the legal aspects of it. I'm sure that goes into some of your disability etiquette training as well. But yeah, I think the biggest takeaway, if you're new to the space, is that there are resources out there for you should not be like, well, I just don't know. There's a lot of resources out there through Disability In or with Cedar's group. And, if you don't have something or you're interested in something, ask. You'll be surprised that we have there's lots of info out there. We may not have something currently made, but we can customize things for you and be, you know, if that's something that's going to help your company move to the next level, all three of us are here to help do that. So whatever that looks like. So.
Absolutely. And actually, Andy, I'm glad that you mentioned that you do those more specific, because it's great for us in this space to all know who's doing what. We always want to steer people the right way. Like you said, if anybody asks me for things that we can't do, I always want to know who can and who we can send in the right direction. Because we're all working in the space for inclusion. That's the ultimate goal, right?
That is absolutely true. Absolutely true. And we're stronger together than not. That's for sure. So.
And we kind of talked to Andy earlier about how this is just not, a situation in our area. It's worldwide. People have the same questions, the same concerns. There's still the same myths out there. So as you know, I'd like to encourage our participants to share this information with their colleagues within their organization, outside of their organization, because it just starts with one person, and the impact that one person can have can affect many people's lives. So we're grateful for the participants, for you, and for your knowledge base and in your hard work over the last 20-something years.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure. And like I said, next time we need to plan it outside COVID pandemic, and that way we can actually be in person. I think that'd be awesome. So
I support Jackson. Well, I love Evanston as well, but Jackson's just fun.
Well, Andy, before this actually made me think of a question as we were chatting here for you. What is in your mind, and maybe a few come up, but what is the biggest fear or myth that employers have around the hesitancy of disability inclusion that you have found with the employers you've worked with?
fear of the unknown. And I know that's very broad, right? But it's like I can create whatever that unknown is to either engage or disengage from, right? So whatever that unknown is, it's like, well, it can be scary because I can get myself cranked up over it. You know, again, I don't want to be the one who screws something up, right? And that's the big part. I think the other part about it is that you have more of ability to make an impact that Wanda was just talking about. You know, one person, it's the pebble in the lake effect, right? It's a ripple effect. It's my first hire that I made and it was scary. I mean, I'll be completely honest, when you sit there and say, hey, let's go hire somebody with autism to work in a public facing organization with lots of volume, such as AMC theaters. And I'm like, to do what? I mean, I'm thinking back room. I mean, my thing was, I actually tried to put people in boxes of like, that disability can only do X. And I think that's one of the things that we default to is like, well, they can only do such and such, because we try and put ourselves in the place of that individual. But if we allow that person to sit there and explain to us what they can do, and we give them opportunities, it will blow your mind. I mean, some of our top producers, our first hire actually was the first person to score a perfect 100 on basically it's an observed assessment. And that was our performance management at the time. A manager stood back 20 feet and watched for about a half an hour an employee engage the public, their job, doing what they're supposed to do. And one of those aspects is to make 5 people smile in a row, right? I mean, they didn't know that that's what it was, but you had to have 5 smiles in a row. The ironic thing is Kyle, our first hire, was the first person to score 100 on that assessment in his theater in Kansas City, in the Midwest region, which actually went from St. Paul to San Antonio to Denver to St. Louis. He was the first employee to score 100. Kyle continues to this day to outperform many of his peers because of the fact it's just who he is. That's how he engages people. Now, granted, we did have to have a conversation when he first started, he's a hugger. He loves to hug, but he's 6'3" and about 260. I mean, he's a great big guy, but you had to explain to him not hug, but he just has this way of connecting with people and his smile is infectious. And so don't try and put yourself in the position of the person with the disability, because you cannot do that. You do not understand. Give them the opportunity to do what they can do best. And that would probably my biggest thing is our biggest fear is we try and unknown is not safe for us. It's just not a comfortable spot. So it's like, well, okay, I can just impose myself into that person's abilities, and you can't do that. You got to give them an opportunity. So
Such a good, yeah, really good point there. Well, Wanda, do you have anything else, or Andy, before we let everyone go for the day?
Just want to remind everybody to fill out their evaluation. We'd love to receive your feedback. Also, we'd like to know if there's future webinars you're interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
last thing I would say is just start one thing. Just do one thing. If you took anything away from today, it's just do one thing. Don't try and drink the ocean all at once. Just do one thing and move the needle. So
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Andy, so much for joining us today. Thank you all for attending. That'll do it for us, and we'll be sending you information soon, including this recording.